I never thought my 68th birthday would pass inside an abandoned garage in Newark's industrial district, surrounded by the sharp stench of motor oil and layers of dust that had accumulated for decades. And yet here I was, standing in the dark, my hand trembling around a strange key, tears blurring my vision, while my son's voice still rang in my head, cold and ruthless as if he had spoken it only moments ago. "You're just a useless old woman. What could you possibly do with real assets? Dad knew that." My hand shook in waves as I finally managed to fit the key into the rusted lock. The old door groaned in protest as I pushed it open. The flashlight beam in my hand swept across the space, ripping apart decades of sealed darkness. And then I saw it. I froze. My breath caught in my chest as the light revealed what had been hidden inside. Impossible. This couldn't be what Clarence meant when he left me just one garage in his will. But let me start from the beginning. You need to understand how I ended up here, homeless on my own birthday, clutching a suitcase that held what was left of a 42-year marriage. That day began in a lawyer's office. I stood beside my son, Jordan, wearing a perfectly tailored suit, immaculate posture, an icy expression, and me, in the same black dress I had worn for the past 3 weeks, since Clarence's funeral. Michael Donnelly, our family attorney for decades, looked unusually uneasy as he prepared to read the will. He adjusted his glasses, drew a deep breath, and said, "Before I begin, I want to assure you that everything that follows is legally binding and has been carried out precisely according to the instructions of Mr. Clarence Lewis." Looking back, I should have realized that wasn't small talk. It was a warning. The reading of the will passed as if through fog, but certain lines cut through with brutal clarity. To my son, Jordan Lewis, I leave the penthouse at the Jersey City waterfront along with my primary investment portfolio. And then, almost as an afterthought, to my beloved wife, Hattie Lewis, I leave the property located at 1420 Industrial Parkway, Newark Industrial District, the garage and everything inside. A garage. After 42 years of marriage, my husband left me. A garage. Before I could even react, I saw Jordan's face change. In an instant, the solemn grief vanished, replaced by a barely concealed triumph. His hand came down on my shoulder, squeezing, slightly harder than necessary, as he leaned in and whispered, "Don't worry, Mom. I'll make sure you're taken care of." I was too stunned to respond, too disoriented to ask questions. Why would Clarence do this? Where was I supposed to live? What was I supposed to do now? The answer came faster than I expected, and far more cruelly. That night, Jordan drove me back to the penthouse overlooking the city, the place Clarence and I had lived for the last 15 years of our marriage. The moment I stepped through the door, Jordan set my suitcase down in the foyer. "I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay." I stared at him, unable to process what I'd just heard. "What did you say?" "The penthouse is mine now. It's in the will." His voice carried a tone I knew too well, smooth, rehearsed, the same voice he used in business negotiations. "Tomorrow I have colleagues coming over to discuss renovating Dad's study into a home office. I need to start making changes." "So, where do you want me to go?" The question came out small and confused. Jordan shrugged, an indifference so ruthless it felt like a slap. "You can stay with Aunt Helen for a while, or there's always that garage Dad left you." He smiled, but it wasn't the smile I used to know. It was sharp, cold, unfamiliar. "I honestly don't understand why Dad left you that junkyard. What are you going to do with it? Open a mechanic shop at your age?" Something collapsed inside me. "Jordan, this is my home. Your father and I—" "It's not your home anymore." He cut me off, his voice hardening. "It's mine. Dad made that very clear." I reached behind me, gripping the back of a chair to steady myself. "I need time to find somewhere to live. Surely you don't expect me to leave tonight." And then he said it. words that would echo in my head for hours afterward as I drove aimlessly through unfamiliar streets until I stopped in front of a rundown garage in an industrial zone. "You're just a useless old woman. What could you possibly do with real assets?" Dad knew that. The cruelty was too sudden, too foreign compared to the son I thought I had raised. I couldn't even react. I simply picked up my suitcase, my handbag, and the key Attorney Donnelly had handed me after the reading, and walked out of the place that had once been my home. And now, I was standing here, in front of a forgotten garage door. The flashlight beam in my hand revealed a scene my mind couldn't process fast enough. Inside there was no trash, no abandoned tools like I'd expected. Instead, the space held 3 cars, each covered by a perfectly fitted custom cloth, arranged with precision that felt almost obsessive. But what made my heart stall was the sliver of silver gleaming at the front of the garage, the unmistakable grille of a vintage Aston Martin. The polished surface caught the flashlight like a beacon in the dark. What is this? And why did Clarence hide this from me all these years? I stepped closer, pulled forward by confusion and curiosity. My fingers trembled as I tugged the cover off the Aston Martin. The soft fabric slid down, revealing a pristine silver 1964 DB5, exactly like the one Sean Connery drove in the James Bond films Clarence adored. It glittered beneath my flashlight, as if it had just rolled off the production line, not as if it had been abandoned in a dark garage for years. "Clarence," I whispered into the stillness. "What did you do?" In 42 years of marriage, my husband had never mentioned collecting cars, never once showed a hint of this passion, this secret life. I moved to the second car, my pulse quickening as I pulled away its cover. A 1956 Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing emerged, its deep blue paint flawless, chrome details sparkling like stars under the beam. The third was a 1967 Ferrari 275 GTB/4 in a rich, dark red, a shade that reminded me of the wine Clarence always ordered on our anniversaries. Each car came with a leather portfolio containing provenance documents, maintenance records, purchase agreements. I wasn't an expert, but I knew this much. These weren't just beautiful cars. These were museum-grade treasures. "There has to be an explanation," I murmured. And then I saw an envelope taped to the wall right beside the light switch. My name, Hattie, written in Clarence's familiar handwriting. I pulled it down and accidentally flipped the switch. Modern LED lights flooded the space. Only then did I truly understand. This wasn't an abandoned garage. This was an automotive sanctuary, meticulously designed, climate control, specialized flooring, a security system, every detail calculated. I sank onto a leather chair against the wall, the envelope heavy in my hands, and I opened the letter. The entire content of the letter is preserved in meaning, smoothed for flow and coherence as above, without omitting any details, through the ending. When I pressed the letter to my chest, tears spilling uncontrollably, one thing became painfully clear. Just hours earlier, my son had thrown me out of the place I had once called home, called me a useless old woman, while believing he was the one receiving the valuable inheritance. He was wrong about everything. But that was only the beginning, because Clarence didn't just leave me a secret. He left me a choice. And in the next part, you'll see what I do when a woman who has been dismissed realizes she was never as weak as they thought. Don't go anywhere. The next part will completely change how you see the true value of a person. I spent that first night on a leather sofa, something I only happened to discover inside a small office connected within the garage complex. It wasn't until the next morning, when my mind was a little less dizzy, that I truly understood how thoroughly Clarence had prepared. That office wasn't just a temporary corner inside a garage. It had a compact bathroom with a shower, a mini fridge stocked with bottled water and basic food, and in a small closet, there were a few outfits in my exact size, tags still on, as if they'd just been purchased. My practical husband had anticipated that one day I might need a temporary refuge here. But no matter how much Clarence had planned, there was one thing he couldn't prepare for me: sleep. That night, sleep never came. I lay on the sofa, staring at the ceiling. My hand still trembled as I held Clarence's letter. Every time I closed my eyes, Jordan's face appeared. Not tonight's Jordan, the man who casually set my suitcase in the foyer and threw me out like an old item, but Jordan at 5 years old, tiny, clinging to me after a nightmare. "Mom, I'm scared you'll disappear." "I'll never disappear, sweetheart. I'm always here." I stared at the ceiling and asked, like I was asking the darkness itself, how did the child who once trembled in his mother's arms become a man who could throw his mother out like garbage? I turned over, tears soaked into the pillow. My phone vibrated, a message from Aunt Helen. "Jordan said you're staying with me? Where are you, Hattie? I'm worried." I went still. Even that, my son had lied about. I didn't reply, not because I didn't trust Helen, but because I didn't know if I could bear the feeling of having to explain to family that my own son had thrown me out of the house tonight. Instead, I opened my photo folder, searching for something, anything, to make sense of it. There was a picture from last Christmas. Clarence had grown noticeably thinner, but he still forced a smile as he stood by the tree. Jordan stood beside him, phone in hand, not even looking at the camera. I remembered exactly what I'd said that day. "Sweetheart, put the phone away. It's family time." "You don't understand. I'm closing an important deal." And Clarence had rested his hand on my shoulder, gently shaking his head. "Let him be, Hattie. Some lessons he has to learn on his own." Back then, I thought my husband was simply being tolerant. Now I understood. He had known. He had seen what I kept refusing to see. I scrolled further. Another photo, Jordan at 12, his baseball jersey smeared with mud, sprinting toward the camera with a radiant grin. Clarence stood beside him, a hand on his shoulder, his face bursting with pride. "Dad, I hit a home run." "I know, son. I saw. I always see you." I stared at that picture so long my eyes burned. When did everything change? When did the light in Jordan's eyes go out, replaced by cold calculation? Or had that coldness always been there, smoldering underneath, simply waiting for the right moment to surface? I set the phone down. My chest felt packed tight. The room was too silent, too unfamiliar. The smell of leather and motor oil felt like a reminder that I was far from everything, far from the bed with familiar sheets, far from the life I once knew, and far from the son I thought I had. And then I realized something that sent a chill through me. Clarence didn't just leave me assets. He left a test. Not to test me, to test Jordan. Only Jordan had no idea he was taking that test, tonight. And I lay there amid motor oil and darkness, trying to breathe through the pain, as if an entire former life had been stripped away. But if Clarence had set a trap here, then the only question was, why was he so sure I would find it on the very first night? Around 3 a.m, I finally surrendered to sleeplessness. I turned on the light. In the office desk drawer, I found a leather notebook. My name was embossed on the cover in gold. I opened it. On the first page was Clarence's handwriting. "My dearest Hattie, if you find this on the first night, and I believe you will, because I know you can't sleep when your mind is full, know that I understand. I understand the pain, the confusion, the feeling of betrayal, not only by our son, but perhaps even by me, for keeping this secret. But Hattie, I need you to understand. Every decision I made came from love. Love for you, love for our son, even if it meant loving him by letting him face consequences. This notebook is yours. Write in it. Scream into it if you have to. But remember, you are stronger than you think. You always have been. With all my love, Clarence." My throat tightened. My hand shook as I turned to the next blank page. I held the pen, but I didn't know where to begin. And then the words spilled out, as if I'd carried them inside me for far too long. "Clarence, how could you leave me alone with all of this? I'm angry with you. Angry that you knew about Jordan, knew about your illness, and said nothing to me. But I also miss you until I feel shattered, because you loved me enough to plan all of this, because you saw what I refused to see. Our son. Oh, Clarence, where did our boy go? I miss little Jordan. Jordan, who used to climb into our bed every Sunday morning, wedge himself between us and say, 'This is my family. I love my family.' Now he looks at me like a burden, an obstacle, someone useless. Maybe I really am useless. Maybe you were wrong." I stopped. The ink blurred as tears fell onto the page. No, Clarence wasn't wrong. He left these things to me not out of pity, but because he believed I was strong enough to use them wisely. I closed the notebook and held it tight to my chest. And then, as the first dawn light slipped through the garage window, sleep finally came. Late, like a reluctant concession. Daylight made everything clearer. The garage wasn't an abandoned industrial space. It was a meticulously renovated facility, a modern security system, climate control, and customized lighting, designed specifically to showcase what was inside. The rundown exterior was only a deliberate disguise, hiding the real treasure within. After a simple breakfast, a granola bar and bottled water, I took the phone number Clarence had written in the letter and called Raymond Foster. Even though it was early, he answered on the second ring. "Mrs. Lewis," he said, his voice deep, warm, and steady. "I've been expecting your call." "First, please accept my condolences," he continued. "Clarence wasn't just a client. He was a friend." "Thank you, Mr. Foster," I replied. My voice was still thick from crying. I'm overwhelmed. I only discovered the garage and what's inside last night." "Yes," he said. "Clarence mentioned that you wouldn't know until after he passed. I'm happy to answer any questions and support you in any way I can. Would you like me to come to the garage?" 2 hours later, a well-dressed man in his 60s arrived in an unassuming sedan. He parked carefully beside my old Toyota. A deed to a charming little house in Cape May. Cape May, the seaside town my husband and I had visited a few times over the years. Every time we went, Clarence would hold my hand as we walked along the old streets, admiring the storybook houses, and he would say, "If there's a place to grow old in peace, it's probably here." I always thought it was just an offhand comment from a man who loved quiet, but according to the paperwork, Clarence had bought that house 4 years ago, fully furnished, ready to live in. I had a house, a real house. Not just that garage. Even though that garage and what it contained was so valuable, I still felt dizzy thinking about it. That afternoon I drove to Cape May. Strangely, the coastal road soothed something inside my soul, something that had fractured the day Clarence died. As Ocean Avenue ran along the cliffs, opening up glimpses of the vast blue sea, I realized I was breathing more deeply than I had at any point in the past several weeks. I followed the GPS directions, passing through Cape May's charming center with its fairy tale cottages and upscale shops. Then the car turned onto tree-lined streets. The farther in I went, the more residential and quiet it felt, as if the whole town were softly saying, "This is where you come home." When the GPS announced, "You have arrived," I stopped in front of a modest stone house, partly hidden behind old cypress trees. The property wasn't large or showy, but it radiated privacy and warmth, the kind of warmth that made you want to take your shoes off right at the doorstep, that made you naturally lower your voice. A natural wooden gate opened onto a stone path that curved through a small garden, trimmed and tended with quiet elegance. I pulled out the key tucked inside the document packet. My hand still trembled slightly. I opened the Dutch door and stepped inside. And I stopped cold. Not because the house was luxurious, but because every detail inside seemed chosen specifically for me. The living room had built-in bookshelves wrapping around a stone fireplace. There was a cozy sitting corner in the exact color palette and style I'd always loved. Natural light poured through the multi-pane windows, scattered across the wood floor, and settled on a hand-woven rug with delicate patterns, like a gentle whisper. I walked slowly through each space, stunned as I went. The kitchen had been updated with modern touches, while still keeping its traditional charm, with a small breakfast nook overlooking the garden. There was only one bedroom, not big but warm, and from there a private porch opened up, where I could see the ocean faintly between the neighboring rooftops. I thought my heart would calm once I'd seen enough. But then I stepped into the small study just off the living room. And right there, my restraint fell apart. Above the simple writing desk hung a painting I recognized instantly, a watercolor of the Venice canals, where Clarence had proposed to me. It was painted by a street artist decades ago. We had lost the original during a move many years back. And yet now, on the wall of this small study, was a perfect replica, as if Clarence had commissioned it from my memory itself. Tears surged up, not the desperate sobbing I'd endured for weeks. This time, it was a softer release, lighter and deeper. Clarence had created this space for me with unbelievable care and attention to every small thing that could make me feel steady, feel loved, feel as if I still mattered. Even in death, he was still taking care of me in a way I was only beginning to understand. I sat down in the chair by the window, leaned back against the blue cushion, my favorite shade, watched the late-day light slip through the trees, and for the first time since the will was read, I truly felt at home. But that very moment of being home startled me with another thought. If Clarence had prepared this house 4 years ago, that meant he had been planning for today for a very long time. And if he had planned this thoroughly, then he had to know what Jordan would do after inheriting the penthouse. I suddenly realized what I was experiencing wasn't only care, it was also a move within Clarence's plan. And I wondered, with a chill running down my spine, so what comes next? And when Jordan realizes he can no longer control me, how will he react? A light knock at the door pulled me out of my thoughts. I opened it and saw an elegant woman in her late 70s standing on the threshold. In her hands was a covered dish. "Hello," she smiled warmly. "You must be Hattie. I'm Margaret Winters. I live 2 houses down." I blinked in surprise. "You know me?" Margaret nodded, then held the dish out to me. "Clarence asked me to keep an eye out for when you arrived. I'm one of the few people who knew about his project. He made me promise not to contact you until you truly came to claim the house." Her eyes narrowed kindly. "It's just a simple stew. I figured you probably wouldn't want to worry about cooking on your first night here." I took the dish. A strange sensation ran along my spine, not fear, but emotion, as if Clarence's hand were still resting on my shoulder through other people. "Thank you," I said. "Would you like to come in?" We sat and drank tea in the kitchen. Margaret spoke gently, and each sentence felt as if it were filling in the gaps in my understanding. "Clarence was very meticulous about doing everything the right way," she explained. "He brought photos of your house in the city. He tried to capture your taste and then create something that belonged to you and to Cape May at the same time." I drew in a slow breath. "I had no idea he did any of this," I admitted. "He kept it completely secret." Margaret nodded, as if she'd heard those words from Clarence himself. "He mentioned it," she said. "He said it was to protect you, though he didn't explain exactly how." Then she looked at me, direct but gentle. "He also said, when you finally came here, you might need a friend, someone who understands what it's like to rebuild a life after loss." I went still. "You've lost someone too?" Margaret smiled, a smile soft and sad, like a page being folded shut. "My husband, 8 years ago," she answered. "It becomes different, if not easier, and having good neighbors helps." When Margaret left, she promised to introduce me to others in the community when I felt ready, and as I watched her go, I realized Clarence's thoughtfulness ran deeper than I'd imagined. He didn't just leave financial security. He didn't just leave a physical house. He also thought about my emotional and social needs, as if he knew that what destroys people after loss isn't only money or shelter, but loneliness. That night, I slept in the warm bedroom of the house. The distant sound of waves lulled me to sleep, along with the soft ticking of the pendulum clock in the hallway, a sound that reminded me of the clock in my childhood home. For the first time since Clarence died, my sleep was deep and undisturbed. The next morning I was sitting in the garden, sipping my morning coffee, when my phone rang. A familiar number. Jordan. I stared at the screen, my heart tightening for a brief moment. I hesitated, remembering how our last interaction had crushed me. Then I answered, "Hello, Jordan." "Where are you?" His voice carried more irritation than concern. "Aunt Helen said you haven't contacted her." "I'm fine, Jordan," I replied, forcing my tone to stay neutral. "I found a place to stay." "Good," Jordan said immediately, not waiting for anything else. "You need to come pick up the rest of your things from the penthouse. I have an interior designer starting tomorrow, and they need everything cleared out." Not a single apology, not one acknowledgement of cruelty, only a new demand and the same old contempt. "I understand," I said, and strangely, a calm settled over me, calm enough to surprise even me. "When would be convenient for you?" "Tomorrow morning before 9. I have meetings all day." I looked down at the documents spread across the garden table, proof of Clarence's love and careful planning. I thought about the man who had prepared not only a roof over my head, but friends, a community, a next life. Then I thought about my son, the one who could erase his mother from his life simply because she had become inconvenient. And I made a decision. "I'll be there," I said. My voice was calm, controlled, completely different from the mother who was always gentle, always enduring, always saying yes, the way Jordan was used to. In that very tone, something had changed, and both of us knew it. The next morning, I arrived at the penthouse at exactly 8:45. For the first time in weeks, I took my appearance seriously. I wore one of the new outfits from the closet in the garage, a simple but elegant navy suit, astonishingly well-fitted. My hair was neat and polished, too. Small rebellions, really. But strangely, they felt like armor, helping me stand steady before the confrontation I knew would not be easy. Jordan opened the door with his phone still in his hand. He barely looked up as I stepped into the space that had been my home for 15 years. The penthouse felt different, emptier, colder, as if someone had drained all the warmth from the walls. A few of my decorative items were gone, and the family photos that used to line the hallway, smiles, hugs, moments I once believed were proof of a family, had been taken down. Only pale rectangular marks remained on the wall, eerie in their emptiness. "Finally," Jordan said, slipping his phone into his pocket. "I boxed up most of your personal things already. The designer will be here at 9:30, so we need to do this quickly and efficiently." No greeting, no question about where I'd slept after being thrown out. Only a schedule, and his convenience. "Good morning, Jordan," I replied, surprised at how steady my voice sounded. "I see you've started redecorating." Jordan shrugged and led me into the master bedroom. Several cardboard boxes were stacked in a pile beside the bed, on the side that used to be mine. "There's no reason to wait. This place needs a complete update to maximize value." "Value?" I repeated slowly. "Are you planning to sell it eventually?" "It's too big for one person, and the market is hot." Jordan spoke as if he were explaining a normal deal. "I'll renovate, enjoy it for a year or so, then sell it for a significant profit." The home Clarence and I had built together, in my son's mouth, it was nothing more than inventory. A sharp pain pulled through my chest, but I only nodded. "I understand. What about Dad's things?" Jordan waved vaguely toward another corner, where a few boxes had also been taped up carelessly. I'm keeping Dad's Rolex and his cufflink collection. The rest is just clothes and old man stuff." He spoke quickly, as if he wanted to finish. "Take whatever you want. I'll donate the rest." Old man stuff. I repeated the phrase in my mind and walked toward the boxes. In the first one, I found Clarence's favorite books, his collection of vintage fountain pens, the sweater I'd given him last Christmas, still carrying a faint trace of his scent, as if it were trying to cling to this world a little longer. Each item was a piece of the man I loved, and now those pieces had been labeled by our son, worthless. I began sorting methodically. I set aside what mattered to me, what I could not let go. Meanwhile, Jordan paced back and forth like someone waiting for paperwork to end, glancing at his watch every few minutes. Finally, he snapped, impatience in his voice. "Can't you go faster?" "It's just stuff, Mom." He jerked his chin. "You don't even have anywhere to put all of it." I looked up at him. Not the way I used to look at him, like a mother looking at her child, but like I was looking at a grown man trying to understand who he had truly become. Jordan was handsome like his father. Those features were undeniable. But in his eyes, there was none of Clarence's warmth, no compassion, no softness, only cold calculation. When did that happen? When did ambition and materialism drain him until he was hollow like this? "I have a place," I said, my voice gentle but firm. "And I'll take as much time as I need. This isn't just property, Jordan. These are memories." Jordan rolled his eyes. "Fine. I have calls to handle. Just be done before 9:30. And then he strode out of the room without looking back. I sat among the boxes, and for the first time I realized something terrifying. Jordan's cruelty didn't come from anger. It came from indifference. Anger, at least, is still emotion. It proves someone still cares. But Jordan didn't. He spoke about old man stuff as if he were talking about garbage. He spoke about the home as if it were a transaction. He spoke about his mother as if she were an obstacle to his schedule. And I wondered, not with tears, but with a coldness running down my spine, if a son could be that indifferent to the memory of his own father, how indifferent could he be to his mother? I continued carefully selecting what to take, and as I worked, I felt myself moving through every layer of grief, not only for Clarence, but for the son I thought I had raised. Had Jordan always been this cold, or had I simply refused to see it, making excuses for the growing cruelty I'd witnessed over the years? Clarence had seen it clearly, clearly enough to build a complex plan, a plan to protect me from my own child. At the bottom of the last box, I found something that stole my breath. A small wooden box, old and worn, roughly carved with a heart. I recognized it immediately. Jordan had made it in third-grade crafts class and given it to me on Mother's Day. Inside was a crumpled scrap of paper, childish handwriting scrawled across it. "To the best mom in the world, you always make everything better. I love you so much. Jordan." My hands shook as I held the paper. Was the boy who wrote those words, the boy who used to cling to me and call me his hero, still somewhere inside the man who had casually thrown me out onto the street? Or was that boy already dead, replaced entirely by this cold, calculating version? I placed the little box carefully into my personal bag. Jordan would never see it again, would never know I had saved it. When I finished sorting, I found Jordan in what used to be Clarence's study, now half cleared out. My husband's beautiful mahogany desk, the one he had inherited from his father, was gone. In its place sat a glossy glass and chrome desk that looked more like a spaceship than furniture. "I'm done," I said from the doorway. Jordan glanced up from his laptop. "Great. Do you need help carrying things down? I can call the doorman." "That would be wonderful," I replied. "Thank you." I hesitated, then added slowly, "I want to say a proper goodbye to this place. If you don't mind, 15 years of memories is worth standing still for a few minutes." Something flickered across Jordan's face, irritation, impatience, and maybe, just for a second, a trace of guilt. But he nodded anyway. "Fine. Whatever." His tone was blunt. "Just lock up when you leave. I'm going downstairs to meet the designer." Jordan brushed past me without another word, leaving me alone in the hollowed-out penthouse. I walked slowly through each room, as if walking through memories, beautiful and painful at the same time. In the bedroom, I opened the closet one last time and rested my hand on a few of Clarence's remaining items Jordan hadn't boxed yet. Just that small touch was enough to tighten my throat. Then, behind the closet, I saw something. One of Clarence's old leather bags, pushed deep into the corner, as if someone had hurriedly hidden it. I pulled it out and unzipped it. Inside was a sealed envelope. My name was written on it in Clarence's handwriting, with a note. "If you find this, Hattie, this is a backup copy of everything in the garage safe, just in case." C. My husband was smart and thoughtful to the point of being infuriating. Backup copies for backups. I slipped the envelope into my handbag like I was tucking away unexpected treasure, the final gift from this final visit. When the doorman had helped load the things I'd chosen into the car, I looked back at the building one more time before driving away. Inside me was a strange emotion, mixed with loss and release. The penthouse had been our home, full of memories, both beautiful and painful. But it had never truly been mine in the way Clarence had intended for the garage, and everything inside it. I drove straight back to Cape May, back to the seaside house waiting for me, and for the first time since that fateful birthday, I felt like I was driving home, not leaving something behind anymore, but moving towards something new. 3 months had passed since the day Jordan left Cape May, with simmering anger still burning beneath the surface. Autumn arrived quietly, bringing subtle changes I only began to notice as my life gradually steadied again. Cooler mornings, softer sunlight, and a gentler palette washing over the seaside town. The streets were no longer packed with tourists. The pace slowed, as if Cape May itself were allowing me to breathe again from the beginning. I slowly settled into a new rhythm, dividing my time between caring for the house, exploring the surrounding community, and learning how to manage the responsibilities that came with the unexpected legacy Clarence left behind. With guidance from Patricia Winters, the real estate attorney Raymond had introduced to me, I set up a clear system to oversee the various properties and investments. Everything ran in an orderly, transparent way, exactly as Clarence used to do when he was alive. The cars remained safely stored in the garage in Newark, maintained monthly by Raymond's team. I even drove the Aston Martin once. The trip along the coastal road was slow and cautious, but it gave me a strange thrill, mixed with an unexpected sense of familiarity, as if I were touching a private part of the world Clarence had loved, and somehow still sharing it with him. Jordan and I maintained a tense but polite distance. We communicated mostly by email, in a professional tone, strictly about practical matters. No check-ins, no attempt to repair anything. As Patricia had predicted, the early legal probing about challenging the inheritance quickly dissolved once attorneys confirmed the strength of the legal structures Clarence had established. Jordan's most recent message, sent 2 weeks earlier, was brief and cold. He wanted me to mail back some family photos and a few personal documents, not a single question about how I was living. I was trimming the rose bushes in front of the house when an unfamiliar car stopped at the gate. A woman stepped out, tall, neatly built, dressed in the professional way of someone used to handling crises. She walked toward me with determined steps and offered a business card. "Mrs. Lewis, I'm Diane Reeves, Jordan's assistant. May I speak with you for a moment?" There was something in the way she held her shoulders straight, in the way her eyes tried to stay composed while pressure showed underneath, that sent a faint wave of worry through me. "Of course," I said. "Is something wrong?" She glanced around, as if weighing the level of privacy. "Maybe. We should speak inside." In the living room, Diane sat on the edge of the sofa and declined my offer of tea. "Mrs. Lewis," she began, getting straight to the point, "I'm here because Jordan is facing some serious setbacks. He asked me to speak with you directly because he's concerned you won't pick up if he calls." "What kind of setbacks?" I asked, though I already had a vague idea. Mostly financial. Diane opened the slim portfolio she had brought. The penthouse renovation costs have gone nearly double the original budget. There were structural issues no one could have anticipated, and it forced significant additional investment. I nodded, not particularly surprised. Clarence had mentioned the building's aging infrastructure years ago, but his proposals for preventive maintenance were dismissed as unnecessary expenses. At the same time, Diane continued, Jordan's main investment has also run into trouble. He put a large amount of capital into a development project that became entangled in legal barriers. The details are complicated, but the short version is, he's facing a major loss, while his liquid cash flow is very limited. I understand, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Jordan had always chased high-risk strategies, preferring quick, flashy returns over long-term stability. And this has what to do with me? Diane shifted slightly on the couch. Frankly, Mrs. Lewis, Jordan needs financial support. He believes you have the resources to help him avoid bankruptcy and losing the penthouse. So the request had finally arrived. Not an apology, not an attempt at reconciliation, but a financial plea, sent through an intermediary to avoid the humiliation of asking directly. Has Jordan considered selling the penthouse? I asked. Even in its unfinished condition, it could still cover most of his debt. He has considered it, Diane admitted, but in its current state, mid-renovation, the property would have to be sold at a significant loss, and there are complications with some contractors, which makes a quick sale difficult. So, I thought, Jordan had damaged his relationship with the crew, maybe by making excessive demands, maybe by payment issues, and now he was paying the price. I appreciate you coming to explain, I said after a beat of silence. Tell Jordan I've heard his request. I'll consider it. Diane looked surprised by my non-committal response. Mrs. Lewis, the situation is fairly urgent. Foreclosure proceedings could begin within a few weeks. I understand, I replied, calm but firm, and I need time to think. That's all I can say today. After I walked the assistant, clearly dissatisfied, out of my house, I sat back down in the garden, reflecting on Jordan's situation. Clarence's words in his letter suddenly echoed in my mind, almost prophetic. He had anticipated that Jordan's financial choices, sooner or later, would lead to a crisis. And now we were standing in that exact script. I asked myself, if Clarence hadn't prepared everything in advance, if I were still dependent on Jordan's goodwill, where would I be right now? Maybe I would have had to beg, or worse, accept being helped under conditions that made me small. And for the first time, I understood clearly. The greatest legacy Clarence left me wasn't money. It was the right to choose. The next morning, instead of calling Jordan, I drove into the city to see the penthouse for myself. The doorman recognized me from my years living there and let me up without calling ahead. What I saw was worse than I expected. The home that had once been elegant had been gutted down to the wooden frame. Electrical wiring and plumbing were exposed like a dangerous maze. Construction equipment lay scattered, coated in a fine layer of dust that suggested no one had worked there for weeks. Expensive marble slabs and custom-ordered furnishings were piled haphazardly. Some had already been damaged by poor storage. As I stepped carefully through what had once been my home, a complicated mix of emotions rose inside me. Sadness at the destruction of memories, disappointment at the waste and mismanagement, and a deep gratitude for Clarence's foresight. I was examining water damage spreading from the primary bathroom into the adjacent rooms when I heard the front door open. "Mom," Jordan's voice echoed through the empty space. "The doorman said you were here." He appeared in the doorway, and I went still as I looked at him. Jordan looked nothing like the last time I'd seen him. His clothes were still expensive, but wrinkled. His face bore the marks of sleepless nights. He'd lost weight. The sharpness of his features made him look more like Clarence than ever, like him during his hardest seasons. "I wanted to see it myself," I said, gesturing around the ruined apartment. Jordan ran a hand through his hair, a familiar gesture of irritation from childhood. "I'm sure Diane spoke to you yesterday. She explained your financial situation." A tense silence stretched between us. "So?" he finally asked. "Have you decided to help me?" I looked at my son, not the confident man who had thrown me out of this home 3 months earlier, but a frightened man facing the consequences of years of putting image over foundation. "I'm willing to help, Jordan," I said slowly, "but not unconditionally, and not by simply writing a check to cover your mistakes." Relief and exhaustion crossed his face at the same time. "What conditions?" "Not here," I replied, moving toward the door. "Not between walls that reflect rushed decisions. Come to Cape May tomorrow. We'll talk about how to solve the immediate crisis and the patterns that created it." Jordan looked like he wanted to argue, to force me into a commitment right then and there. But need outweighed impulse. "Fine," he said. "Tomorrow." As I left the building, the contrast between the wrecked penthouse and the peaceful house in Cape May felt painfully clear. Jordan had received what looked like the more valuable inheritance, a prestigious address, outward wealth, and I had received an abandoned garage and a small, nameless house. Yet now, our fates had reversed, not because of luck, but because of the combination of Clarence's vision and Jordan's choices. Tomorrow would bring hard conversations, turning point decisions. And tonight, I returned to Cape May, to the home Clarence had carefully prepared for me, and thought about how to protect myself, while still honoring both the fears and the hopes he had carried for our son. Jordan arrived at this house at exactly 11, as promised. Compared to the drained figure I'd seen yesterday in the penthouse, today he was visibly polished. His clothes pressed, his hair neat, his eyes working to hold on to confidence. A deliberate effort, I suspected, to prove he was still in control, even though in truth, he wasn't. As for me, I had spent the entire morning preparing, not only mentally, but also preparing the stage for this conversation. I wanted this dialogue to happen in a place that forced a person to slow down, to breathe, to listen. Not in a gutted penthouse, not in a noisy city. "Best view," Jordan remarked dryly, as I led him through the house to the back porch, where I'd arranged comfortable seating and a light lunch. "Your father chose well," I replied evenly. "He remembered how much I love the sea." Jordan's expression tightened when I mentioned Clarence, but he didn't say anything. He just sat where I indicated. The porch overlooked a small garden kept with care, sloping gently downward, and between neighboring houses there was an opening wide enough to see the ocean shimmering blue. The space was quiet, private, and most importantly, neutral. Here, Jordan couldn't hide behind urgency, a ringing phone, or meetings. I poured iced tea for both of us, set the glasses down, and looked at my son directly. "Before we talk about your finances," I said, "I want to show you something." I handed him a leather portfolio I had prepared. Inside were documents I had selected from Clarence's files. Jordan opened it with a tired look, as if bracing for another blow. "These are financial forecasts and maintenance assessments for the penthouse," I explained as he skimmed the pages. "Your father commissioned them 3 years ago. He predicted the building's major systems would deteriorate and eventually require costly repairs. The numbers in this report match almost exactly what you're dealing with now during the renovation." Jordan frowned. "Dad never told me any of this." "He tried to," I corrected gently, "more than once. But every time you brushed him off, said he worried too much, said it was an unnecessary expense. He showed you these reports at our last Christmas, before he received the diagnosis." A flicker of recognition crossed Jordan's face. "That boring building assessment he kept bringing up at dinner?" "Yes." I took a sip of tea. "Your father wasn't just cautious. He was trying to prepare you for exactly the situation you're facing now." Jordan closed the portfolio and set it aside. His jaw tightened. "If you dragged me here just to repeat 'Dad told you so,' I didn't," I cut in, my voice not loud but firm. "I'm setting the context, so you understand why I'm going to help you in my way." After a silence, I continued, "There's a letter from your father. It explains more clearly than anything I could say." Jordan's posture stiffened instantly. "A letter?" he asked quickly. You have something that explains all of this, and you didn't think you should share it? It was addressed to me, Jordan, I replied. And after the way you treated me following the reading of the will, I wasn't exactly rushing to share something so private. I met his eyes without looking away. You called me a useless old woman, and you threw me out of my home. Jordan blinked. A flash of discomfort crossed his face. I was grieving. People say things they don't mean when emotions are high. Is that so? I asked softly. Or is it that when emotions rise, that's when people say what they've been hiding the most? Jordan didn't answer. He only gestured impatiently. Where is it? Do you have the letter here? I stood and went into the study. I brought out Clarence's original letter from the garage and the backup copy I'd found in his leather bag. When I returned, I hesitated for a beat, then handed Jordan the copy. Before you read, I said, I want you to understand one thing. Your father loved you. Everything he did wasn't meant to hurt you, but to protect what he valued. Let me be the judge of that, Jordan replied, taking the letter with an eagerness he could barely hide. I watched him read. Jordan's expression shifted gradually, from guarded to stunned, then darkened. His hand tightened around the paper until his knuckles turned white, especially at the parts where Clarence spoke of his fears about Jordan's character and values. When he finished, Jordan set the letter down very slowly, very carefully, as if one sharp movement would shatter his last remaining control. So, he said, his voice low, dangerous. What did Dad think I was? A greedy, selfish materialist, not trustworthy enough to hold the family's assets? Your father worried that your values had changed over time, I said, keeping my voice gentle. And he worried you would use that power to control my financial well-being. And his solution was to trick me? Jordan snapped, his voice rising with each sentence. To build some elaborate plan so I'd think I inherited the valuable part, while secretly leaving the real value to you? He paced in the small kitchen, energy flaring like heat. Do you know how that feels? He continued. To be manipulated, to be tested like a lab rat, whether I meet the moral standard of Dad's twisted experiment? I stayed seated. I didn't chase his escalation. Your father made his decision based on what he observed over years, I said slowly. Not a day, not a week. If his assessment makes you uncomfortable, maybe what you should do is reflect, instead of simply rejecting it. Reflect? Jordan spun around, incredulous. You want me to reflect on being described as someone heartless in my own father's eyes? The letter doesn't call you a monster, I said clearly. It talks about tendencies, not a permanent verdict. Jordan stared at me, as if searching for an opening to strike back. You're defending this? He asked bitterly. He left you a fortune, then engineered a situation for me to reveal my true nature. And I failed because I expected to receive what the will said? I understood. In a sense, Jordan wasn't entirely wrong. Clarence had created a situation where character would reveal itself through actions, and on that night, Jordan had done exactly what Clarence feared. The question now, I said, my voice tightening, is where we go from here. Jordan gave a dry laugh, without humor. Where do we go? It's obvious. I'm Clarence Lewis's son. I have the right to contest this. Hidden assets, secret trusts. It sounds like a deliberate attempt to break normal inheritance. Your father's legal structures are airtight, I replied evenly. Legal, documented, certified. A dispute would be expensive, drawn out, and almost certainly pointless. Jordan narrowed his eyes. You sound awfully confident, coming from someone who used to say she knew nothing about finances. I've had a few weeks to consult some very capable advisors, I said calmly. People like the ones who helped your father build these arrangements. Jordan braced his hands on the counter, turned away. A long silence dropped between us, heavy as stone. When he turned back, the anger had been replaced by something calculating. I recognized that look, the look Jordan wore in negotiations I'd witnessed for years. What if we compromise? He said slowly, trying to sound reasonable. A fairer distribution. Respect Dad's wishes, but acknowledge my position. Surely half of these assets— No, I cut in. Both Jordan and I seemed momentarily startled by the steadiness in my own voice. "I'm not negotiating your father's final wishes," I continued, slow but firm. "What he left me isn't just money. It's protection. A guarantee that I will never again have to depend on anyone's goodwill, including yours." Jordan's voice hardened. "So that's it? You keep everything and blame Dad's paranoid suspicions?" I stood and met his eyes. "What I do with these assets from this point forward depends on many factors," I said, "but your sense of entitlement to them won't help you." The words landed like a blow. Jordan stared at me as if I were a stranger, and maybe I was. The mother who always swallowed her pain, always stepped back to keep the peace, was not the one standing here now. "You're serious?" he asked, his voice rough. "You're really holding Dad's assets hostage, based on whether I pass a character test?" "I'm respecting the spirit of your father's wishes," I corrected, "including protecting his legacy from being squandered or misused." Jordan grabbed his car keys off the table. "This isn't over, not at all." "Jordan," I called as he headed for the door. He stopped at the threshold without turning around. "Before you run to lawyers," I said, softer now, slower, "try to consider one thing. What if your father was right? What if the flashy inheritance you received was exactly the lesson you needed to see certain truths about yourself?" I paused. "You're still my son, but actions have consequences, and it's time you faced them." The door shut behind him, solid, final. Spring returned to Cape May, painting the front garden in bursts of color so bright they looked almost unreal against the blue ocean. Nearly 9 months had passed since Clarence died, 6 months since I discovered the garage, and 4 months since Jordan's financial crisis forced him to face me and face himself. Those 4 months brought changes I never would have imagined, especially after that heavy conversation. 3 days after we met, Jordan called me. His voice wasn't evasive, wasn't polished. "I'll do it," he said. "All of it, whatever it takes." The journey from there was anything but smooth. The financial restructuring alone took weeks, with accountants and attorneys working almost nonstop, and I gradually realized Jordan's situation was even more tangled than he had initially admitted. The penthouse required a hard decision. In the end, we reached a compromise. Complete only the essential renovations to make it sellable, then sell it to pay off the most urgent debts. But the hardest part wasn't the paperwork. The hardest part was the emotional work Jordan was forced to do. He began weekly therapy sessions with a specialist in family dynamics and financial psychology. At first, he showed up skeptical and irritated, but gradually, those sessions became a place where he began to see himself more honestly. My relationship with Jordan moved into new territory as well. Neither of us navigated it perfectly. Sometimes he still blurted out old lines. Sometimes I still felt pain like a hand pressing into an unhealed wound. But something had changed. Truth began to be spoken more often than convenience. I was tending the rose bushes by the garden gate when a familiar car turned into the driveway. Jordan stepped out, holding a small package. He looked different from both the polished Jordan of before and the desperate Jordan from a few months earlier. His clothes were still good, but less flashy. His posture was less rigid. He wore a short beard that softened the sharp lines of his face, making him resemble Clarence as a young man in a startling way. "The garden looks amazing," he said, then leaned in and kissed my cheek, a gesture that used to feel like formality, but today carried something warmer. "You've truly transformed this place." "I'm just continuing what your father started," I replied, setting my gardening tools down. "Coffee on the porch?" We sat in our usual spot, and I realized that ease had begun to replace the tension that defined our earliest meetings. Jordan still sometimes bristled at the financial restrictions the trust imposed. Occasionally he slipped back into old habits, judging, impatience, the need to control, but the changes were real. "The penthouse closing is next week," he said, stirring his coffee. The final step went smoothly. Because we renovated strategically, we cut about 40% of the loss compared to the initial fire sale estimates. "That's good news," I nodded. "It will give the trust more flexibility for your next step." Jordan set his cup down carefully. "Speaking of the next step, I want your opinion. I was offered a position at a community development organization. They work on affordable housing projects." I couldn't hide my surprise. Jordan had always pursued high-end commercial real estate, luxury projects, and treated affordable housing as unattractive in profit. "That's a major shift," I said. "What made you consider it?" Jordan looked out toward the ocean for a moment before answering. "That failed project, the luxury complex, ended up being auctioned off in bankruptcy," he said. "A nonprofit bought it. They're building mixed-income housing there. Good design, efficient, environmentally conscious." He paused, then continued with an awkward sort of pride. "I've been advising them informally for a few months, and I'm good at it. I still get to do the technical side, but without the pressure to squeeze every last dollar of profit. It matters." I looked at my son and saw genuine life in his eyes, something I hadn't seen in years. "It sounds like you found something that speaks to who you are," I said, "not just to your ambition." Jordan gave a small laugh, tinged with guilt. "Dad would probably find it ironic, me doing affordable housing after years chasing luxury." "I think he'd be pleased," I corrected gently. "Your father always admired worthy goals." Jordan nodded, then reached for the package he'd brought. "Speaking of Dad, that's also why I brought this. While clearing out the penthouse, I found a few things you should have." He opened the package. Inside was the small box I recognized instantly, Clarence's collection of cufflinks and tie pins, the ones Jordan had said he was keeping. Jordan watched me open it, then said slowly, "I kept them because I thought they were a connection to him, but lately I've realized they're just objects. The real connection isn't in the assets." Beneath the cufflinks was a small velvet pouch. I pulled it out, and my heart stopped. My original wedding ring. I thought it had been lost in the penthouse chaos. "I found it in the safe in Dad's office," Jordan said. "And there's this too." He handed me a small envelope with my name on it in Clarence's handwriting. I opened it. Inside was a card, just a few lines. "For our upcoming 45th anniversary, the first band was a promise about the life we would build. This one celebrates the life we created. All my love, always." Tucked into the card was a jeweler's receipt, a custom eternity band commissioned only a few weeks before Clarence's final hospital admission. "Mom, the jeweler still had the order," Jordan said. "I picked it up for you." He handed me a small box. I opened it. Inside was a sapphire and diamond ring. Elegant, understated, exactly my taste. When the spring sun fell onto it, the stones caught the light and threw small glimmers across the porch table. "Oh, Clarence," I whispered, my hand trembling as I slid the ring on beside my old wedding band. They complemented each other perfectly, the simple gold of the early days and the gemstones of a journey that had endured storms. Jordan stayed quiet, letting me have the moment. When I looked up, I saw something on his face that had been missing for a long time. Softness, a respect unclouded by impatience or calculation. "Thank you," I said. "This means more than I can describe." We talked for nearly another hour about his new role, updates from the trust and the assets, the future he was trying to rebuild. Before he left, Jordan paused at the garden gate. "I wanted to ask, what about the cars? In the Newark garage Dad left you?" I smiled, thinking of my recent conversation with Raymond Foster. "I'm keeping the Aston Martin," I said. "Your father would love knowing I drive it along the coast sometimes. The other two will be sold. The proceeds will be split between a fund that supports financial education and a trust for your future children, if you have any." "Future children," Jordan repeated, as if weighing the words. "That sounds optimistic." "Your father was always optimistic," I replied. "Under all his practical planning was a belief that people can change if they're given the right chance." I watched Jordan drive away, and something inside me felt unexpectedly light. The inheritance plan that had once shocked me with its imbalance had, in the end, achieved exactly what Clarence intended. I had security and independence. Jordan had a jolt strong enough to face himself. Not every wound between us had fully healed. Not every lesson was learned overnight, but we had entered a new chapter built on truth, not convenience, on respect, not default roles. That evening, I drove the Aston Martin along the coastal road. The engine rumbled warmly beneath my feet, and the sunset turned the water into molten gold. On my hand were both the simple gold wedding ring from the beginning and the sapphire and diamond ring of endurance to the very end. "You were right," I said out loud to Clarence's memory, letting the wind carry it away. About so many things. The garage key had once opened only a physical door, but in the end, it opened something much bigger. A new understanding of love, legacy, and the courage to begin again, no matter the age, no matter the circumstances. And in that, I knew Clarence would consider this the truest gift of all,